This year's history for the theme is Frontiers. Frontiers in history are major breakthroughs involving people, places, and ideas. Our project, the Transcontinental Railroad, connects to this theme because the idea of a railroad connecting America was a revolutionizing project in the mid-19th century.
Hiring Chinese workers to build the project was mostly because of labor shortages, and they were hesitant to hire them at first, but soon put their prejudices aside and allowed them to work. This was a way that the railroad brought people together.
During construction, many of the workers had to destroy countless tunnels in the rock and found that nitroglycerin, an early stage of dynamite, would be suitable for the job. But in the mid-1800s, using nitroglycerin as an explosive was a relatively new invention.
After the railroad was completed in 1869, by 1880 the Transcontinental Railroad was transporting about $50 million worth of freight, which was good for the economy in the U.S. While this track transported goods, it also created a more affordable and faster way for the people to travel, which led to population spread across America.
Although Chinese workers did not get the same amenities as white workers, Irish workers often did not sterilize their water, which caused waterborne illness when Chinese workers had the idea to boil water into tea in order to sterilize it. In conclusion, the Transcontinental Railroad innovated transportation at the time, and these are all examples of frontiers because while it was being built, many breakthroughs were made, including racial, pyrotechnic, economic, and hygienic advances.
The Transcontinental Railroad's idea of transportation was originally thought of by Asa Whitney in 1849. This idea was not in motion until 1862 when the Pacific Railroad Act was passed.
During the California Gold Rush of 1848, the United States became densely populated, which made it difficult to travel and spread information. So a railroad that connects both the East and West would be convenient for Americans. This railroad took about 6 years for full completion with the help of mostly Irish and Chinese immigrants.
Irish immigrants were escaping from the Great Famine, and Chinese immigrants were coming for the gold rush. Most workers had not a very ideal work environment, since the use of explosives was dynamite, nitroglycerin, and black powder.
These explosives were heavily relied on during the construction of this project. Explosives like nitroglycerin were dangerous because the physical shock can cause an accidental explosion that killed many workers.
The country was in economic, social, racial, and political devastation during and the years to follow the Civil War. The Transcontinental Railroad was created to solve these problems and bring the country back together.
Although it will temporarily achieve some of these goals, it will more emphatically create a historical legacy of racism of Chinese immigrants, a Native American genocide, a continued tension and racism between the North and South, black and white.
The Civil War started in 1861 with the Emancipation Proclamation soon to follow. It was one of the biggest changes in the 1860s politically, with the expectation to free all slaves at the time in the United States. The original Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863 is currently in the National Archives in Washington, D.C.
After the Transcontinental Railroad was built, it largely helped the economy of the United States after the devastating Civil War of 1861, because about $5.2 billion was spent during the war, and even before that, the U.S. government debt was $64.8 million, and this amount only grew quicker when the war began.
The firm of J. Cook & Company closed on September 18, 1873, and the railroad industry with over 300 railroads was now financially troubled. Southern blacks suffered greatly during the Depression. Preoccupied with the harsh realities of falling farm prices, wage cuts, unemployment, and labor strikes, the North became less and less concerned with addressing racism in the South. This causes not political or economic, but racial problems during these financially depressed years.
The Transcontinental Railroad was built in order to help the U.S. recover from the brutal Civil War, but with this there needed to be many workers which varied mainly from Irish and Chinese nationalities.
Looking back, historians say the Chinese, who began arriving in the United States in significant numbers during the California Gold Rush of 1848 to 1855, they were deemed too weak for the dangerous, strenuous job of building the railroad east from California.
The first Chinese laborers were hired in January 1864. In 1865, they were convinced that Chinese workers were suitable for the job, and they started to hire more of them as demand for labor got worse, and 2 years later, about 90% of workers were Chinese.
According to the project, Chinese workers were hired in 1864 and were paid $26 a month, working 6 days a week. They eventually held an 8-day strike in June of 1867. By contrast, Irish workers were paid $35 a month and were provided with housing, while the Chinese were paid 30 to 50% less than white workers. After the strike, the company slowly raised the wages of experienced Chinese workers over the next several months.
The more Indians we can kill, the less will have to be killed in the next war. For the more I see of these Indians, the more I'm convinced that they still have to be killed or be maintained as a species of paupers. This quote was said by W.T. Sherman, who was a soldier in the U.S. This shows how Sherman was ready to kill many buffalo, which is an example of how many soldiers and hunters annihilated the buffalo species, leaving them on the brink of extinction in the early 20th century.
Even though this hunting took a heavy toll on the environment, soldiers like W.T. Sherman more had the motive to kill buffalo in order to kill Native Americans, since buffalo were a vital food source to them, although the buffalo's population has now recovered from near extinction.
Every Indian outbreak I've ever known has resulted in broken promises and broken treaties by the government. This quote is by Buffalo Bill, and he recognized how the U.S. government did not acknowledge the horrible things that they did to make the environment and all the lives of Native Americans, when they made promises or treaties like Buffalo Bill said, only to break them in the future.
The Transcontinental Railroad may have caused racism of Chinese immigrants and Native Americans, but it also caused tension between the North and South and further exacerbated the economic competition for jobs and resources. The Transcontinental Railroad was a significant achievement in American history, but it also highlighted the ongoing issues of racism and discrimination in America in the 19th century.
Many people think of the Irish and Chinese when they think of the Transcontinental Railroad, but in fact there were some African American workers after the Civil War. During the post-Civil War years, into the early decades in the 20th century, black men gained employment on the Transcontinental Railroad, most often as Pullman Company's palace car porters and waiters, helping to define American travel during the railroad transportation era.
The closing of Cook's firm affected the railroad industry very much, like stated in Evidence 1, and it caused many workers to be laid off, get cut wages, and work longer hours, which also affected many African American workers during this economic crisis. Again, as stated in Evidence 1, while the North was preoccupied with the Depression, racism in the South was not recognized.
After the workers were given worse working conditions, there was a great upheaval in 1877, which was one of the biggest railroad strikes during the Depression, with over 100,000 workers participating.
Although this railroad took many years and thousands of workers to complete, the result was worth it when it first opened in 1869. This track was able to transport goods and people across the country, which is an example of how it changed the course of transportation in the 1860s and 70s. The first freight train to leave the station was transporting a load of Japanese tea.
This created a new and improved way for people to buy products and keep up with the latest fashion trends and furnish their houses. This is basically the 1870s equivalent of Amazon. It also installed a sense of confidence in Americans after the word about the railroad's success spread, and it became a symbol of America's industrial advance.
The Transcontinental Railroad also made traveling across the country way more affordable, faster, and convenient for Americans. And although a trip on the railroad was cheap, it boosted the economy and still made a lot of money for the U.S. By the 1890s, the U.S. had the most powerful economy in the world.
After the Transcontinental Railroad's completion, it did not only connect the East and West, but it also transported freight to various parts of America, including Chicago. Railroads like the Transcontinental Railroad gave Chicago access to the western part of America, along with some parts of Asia, for example, China.
In 1865, 6 railroads established the Union Stockyards and Transit Company at the southern edge of the city. This ensured that livestock was transported to Chicago, and later meat packers were established as well in the city. Even after the horrific fire of 1871, Chicago was able to rebuild and grow because of Chicago's position being adjacent to many railroads that transported freight that the city needed in order to expand and prosper.
The The Transcontinental Railroad was built to improve the nation's economy and heal the country after the Civil War. The growth of the nation's economy will become too steep of a cost. At the cost of the introduction of the Chinese racism, the genocide of Native Americans, and a continued racism between the black and white.
As shown by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Navajo Treaty of 1868, and the Opelousas Massacre of 1868, the Transcontinental Railroad has a historical legacy, but like much of U.S. history, the reality does not match the myth.